Hey class, this is Dr. Stubblefield. I just wanted to give you a quick update on things and let you know and comment briefly on Module 13. Um, First of all, we're nearing the end of the semester, so you just want to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row. Bonus points, extra credit points should be now available. So moving into Module 16, they'll become more available. So I think that you can go into Module 16 and begin to work on those if you'd like some extra points. But you need to have had all your previous assignments either completed or scored. So if you're not going to plan on go back and doing an assignment that you missed, you have received a 0 at this point for that assignment. And if you want some arrangement to go back and make that up, we can talk about that. But more than likely, you should just move on to the extra credit. So that's one little note. I also wanted to make a couple of comments on Module 13. The question for discussion was regarding multiple views of communion, and many of you applied a particular way, so I wanted to just go over a couple things with you I think might be helpful for me to supplement in this way. There are actually more than 3 views regarding communion. The 2 views that aren't mentioned is a slightly nuanced version in the Orthodox Church, which doesn't quite go to the level of detail that the Catholic Church discusses and how the elements of communion actually transform into the real blood and body of Jesus. The Orthodox Church typically just says it's a divine mystery without giving into any greater technical detail as the Catholic Church does. So anyway, they still basically hold the same view, but there's a subtle difference. And then a second view that's not mentioned is the more Reformed view or Presbyterian view, which was prominent during John Calvin's time. Calvin, who kind of spearheaded the Reformed doctrine and his institutes, argued differently than Martin Luther. Luther suggested that the very real presence real presence of Jesus is in the elements itself. John Calvin and others like him argued rather that there was a real presence within the believer, or there was an awakened heightened sensation of Jesus being near to the believer during the time of communion. But that was different than Luther's view. Luther's view was that it was actually in the elements, that Christ's presence was in the elements themselves. It's just a shade difference than the Catholic view, to be honest with you. And whereas the more Reformed tradition has said that Jesus is around or with the believer, but not necessarily in the elements themselves. And then I also want to make a note on this. I think this is interesting to me. Many of you, maybe you're just being good neighbors, but many of you didn't want to suggest that others who held differing views on communion than you did were wrong. Many of you suggested that this is just something that, you're right if you think you're right, or your view is equally as good as everybody else's. And I'm just not so sure that I was a little disappointed, in fact, that the students' discussions did not reflect a willingness to disagree and to say that we really think your ideas are wrong, and here's why. Some of you said, well, I just don't agree with that. Some of you said, well, that's good for you, but I had to take my view differently. Well, that's really good discussion in an academic environment. You need to feel free to dialogue and disagree with each other in intelligible and rational ways. I think we get cautious of making other people feel bad, or get cautious about telling people they're wrong because we don't want to offend everybody else. But first of all, you shouldn't be offended if someone tells you that you're wrong about what you believe or how you grew up or something like that. It's okay to be wrong, right? That's not you didn't do anything morally terrible by believing something that has some warrant in scriptural theology. You may still be wrong about that, but you shouldn't be offended if someone tells you that you're wrong, or that your tradition of wrong, or that the people who raised you thought wrongly about something like that. That's not offensive. That's just factual. And so we ought to be, as academics, we ought to be free to disagree with each other passionately. And then I guess the third thing I wanted to mention was that the third thing I wanted to mention was that many of you appealed to your background and how you were raised. Many of you said, I'm a Baptist, and as a Baptist, I was raised to think this way. I'm a Catholic, and as a Catholic, I was raised to. I was a Methodist, so as a Methodist, I was raised. Well, that's really not relevant. I mean, I think it's relevant to understanding your own bias for why you prefer a certain interpretation, and I think that's useful. But everybody has a bias about why they think they're right. I mean, everybody's raised a certain way in a certain time, in a certain moment in history, and we think we're right because partially because we're shaped by those influences, and that's okay. But bias and how we're raised really is not the ultimate determinant for what is right. And which finally leads me to our last point. If you were living in 16th century Europe and you were having a discussion, a theological discussion in Switzerland or in France or in England, and someone came to you and said, "Well, I believe in transubstantiation," and someone else said, "Well, I believe in consubstantiation," and someone else says, "Well, I believe in the real presence view of reformers." Someone else says, "Well, I believe in the symbolic view." No one, I think, would look around and say, "You know, it doesn't really matter. Let's just agree to disagree." No, I think they would look at, if you said that, I think they would look at you and think, "Are you crazy? Of course this matters. This is extremely important. We're dealing with we're dealing with one of the two primary ordinances that the Lord Jesus himself gives to the church. We can't be wrong about these things." In the same way that I think we tend to treat baptism very lightly, like, well, it doesn't really matter. There's good reasons to think one way or the other. Well, if you had asked the Baptists in 16th, 17th century England whether it mattered or not to take the Bible seriously when they were convinced by conscience and reason that baptism by immersion of believers is the only way, those people drowned and were murdered and exiled for their biblical beliefs. To them it matters. And I think we ought not to say, well, there's lots of views, lots of confusion, let's all get along. No, we ought to think, and we ought to use our minds, and we ought to not be overly concerned about hurting each other's feelings, and we ought not to be overly concerned about parting with part of our tradition, or even parting with family over a question of what is right. So the question is what's true. The question is what's right, not and we ought not to worry so much about offending people or offending family or offending brothers about an issue that's really an academic one, but it's also in the interest of obeying Jesus. So I don't think we ought to be very casual about these things. And so I know we're nearing the end of the semester, but we ought to feel free. You ought to feel free to disagree with your fellow classmates about an issue when you know you're right. And those of you who are being disagreed with ought not to be offended by the fact that your friends in this class don't agree with you or think that you're wrong. Of course we think you're wrong. We ought to acknowledge that up front. Of course I think you're wrong about some things. That doesn't mean that I don't like you or that you're somehow less of a person. It just means, of course I think you're wrong. You're deficient in a certain area of your belief. That's okay. And you think I'm wrong. Right? But let's not pretend that we're all right. And let's not pretend that it's just an issue that we don't have to be concerned about. Communion is a very important aspect of what the church does when it gathers to remember the death of Christ. It is very relevant how we do it and how we obey Jesus. So those are my closing words for today. Hope you're doing good. Talk to you later.